Oh, thank you all very much for joining us. And I think you were all listening to the previous session as well. So thank you for doing that. Can I start by inviting each of you, as I did with the previous panel, just very briefly to tell us who you are, starting with Ben Beadle.
Morning folks, Ben Beadle, Chief Executive of the National Residential Landlords Association, a trade body representing property owners, 105,000 of them.
Thank you. Timothy Douglas.
Hello, good morning. Timothy Douglas, Head of Policy and Campaigns at Property Mark. Property Mark is a professional membership body for property agents working in residential sales, lettings, commercial property, valuers and auctioneers, and also property inventory service providers. And we've got over 17,000 members across the UK.
Professor Peter Kemp.
My name is Peter Kemp. I work at Oxford University, and most of my research throughout my career has been on private rental housing and housing benefit.
Thank you. And Sheila Haig.
Hi, I'm Sheila Haig. I'm the Customer Manager at City of Edinburgh Council with a remit covering housing benefit and educational benefits and all things assessment and finance.
Now, normally when we take evidence from somebody based in Edinburgh, they're on the screen. So thank you very much for coming all the way and being here in person. We're grateful. Selene Saxby has the first question.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. What is the impact of current benefit levels and local housing allowance rates on tenants? Who would like to go? Ben?
Disastrous, frankly. We've seen local housing allowance frozen for 3 years. We see rents based on ONS figures increasing at 5% in the 12 months to May, the highest on record. And we see a real squeeze in the sector where we have almost 60% of people that have a gap between their rent and their allowance. And we see landlords experiencing a crisis of confidence too. And so we find ourselves in not the prettiest situation, I think.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I think I'd echo what Ben has just said. I mean, the context is we're in a hugely competitive market at the moment. Demand for private rented property is outstripping supply, and that's evident from our member surveys based on April 2022 to April 23. Demand is up 24% in terms of applicants registering with agents, and of course in that time landlords and agent costs have increased. So essentially where the local housing allowance benefit system comes into play, it's simply not keeping up with that rising costs and rise in rents. And I was just as an example speaking to an agent yesterday based in Portsmouth, and they were reflecting on this, and even in October last year they had a 2-bed flat advertised at £850 per month. They had 84 applicants, and that was October last year. It actually the landlord took a tenant who offered £900, but of course the universal credit is only at £725. So that's an example of the shortfall and the competitiveness of the market at the moment.
Thank you. Professor Kemp.
So the local housing allowance rate was initially set at the median when it was introduced in 2008, and then in 2011 it was reduced to the 30th percentile, and the argument was that people on housing benefit should be in the lower part of the market. And at that point 25% of tenants were on private tenants were on housing benefit. Then the rate was restricted below the increase. It wasn't increased in line with the 30th percentile from 2013, and in 2016 it was frozen at that rate, and then in 2020 the Chancellor unfroze it, and the local housing allowance rate is now set at the rent assessed by the Rent Officer Service for September 2019. So it's set at that level. So if rents go up, then obviously the number of people able to afford private rental housing who are on benefit is going to reduce. And if, as is happening now, rents are really rising rapidly, and Zoopla has reported that rents have risen by 10%, asking rents for new properties, new lettings, has increased by 10%, then that really puts the squeeze on people on housing benefit in terms of what they can afford. and as a result, they then have to use part of the rest of their universal credit to cover the shortfall that's there.
Thank you. Sheila, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'm going to paint a bit of a more positive picture in Scotland. We have a significant fund for discretionary housing payment. Certainly in Edinburgh, our refusal rate sits at around 8%, which is 2% less than the national. At this time, we can support people quite well. As well as that, we've got the Scottish Welfare Fund, where people have income gaps for other essentials that they can be supported by. However, DHP will start to be squeezed now because landlords, given the mortgage increases, are putting their rents up as well. There is a freeze on landlords increasing rents in Scotland at the moment, but how sustainable that is has yet to be seen. So whilst at the moment I would say in Scotland our citizens probably can access quite a bit more in the terms of income than their counterparts down south, I am now getting concerned that DHP is going to be more difficult to manage people's expectations, and saying no and refusing more applications is likely to be the next step.
Thank you. And beyond LHA rates, what other factors make it difficult for benefit claimants to access affordable housing in the social and private rented sectors? Ben?
Yeah, well, just briefly, it's back to that supply point. All of these challenges that we have at the moment, notwithstanding the rate that LHA is set at, comes back to a fundamental lack of supply and demand massively outstripping it. And I think, we've seen the selling off of social homes under right to buy in England. Those haven't been replenished. We've been very reliant on the private rented sector to pick up the slack. And we now find ourselves in a very tricky position where, the PRS is sort of being kicked around as a bit of a political football. Do we like it? Do we not like it? But the reality is we have, 20% of people housed there. And there's many things outside of the LHA rate that are actually conspiring to give that crisis of confidence to the very people that are bringing their properties to the market. Mortgage rates, taxation, regulation. Regulation isn't necessarily a bad thing, but property owners will need to have confidence. And with the threat of rental reform making it more difficult, energy changes, layering on extra cost, we do have a crisis of confidence, and that's not going to help the long-term trajectory to give people the homes that they need.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up just quickly on Scotland. We've got members across Scotland who are doing a lot of work in this area. And just the cost of living legislation, yes, has put a cap on rent rises and a moratorium on evictions, but actually the unintended consequence of that is that the cap doesn't apply to new tenancies, and therefore in this climate of costs rising for landlords, we're actually seeing landlords put up the rents when actually the consideration of that wasn't an issue. And if we look through COVID, landlords and agents worked extremely hard with tenants to maintain tenancies, and rents didn't rise, and actually the consequence of the legislation in Scotland is mean that it's put rents under the spotlight for many landlords and agents. And what they're actually doing, they're raising the rent because they are concerned about anticipated costs in the future, and they're also concerned about a housing bill which will bring in a national system of rent control. So that's just an unintended consequence, just to pick up on the situation in Scotland.
Thank you. Anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, well, I think the housing market, the private rental market, is under a lot of pressure at the moment, and that's for supply and demand reasons. So there's a chronic undersupply of housing in the UK, and it has been really since the 1970s. We can argue about how much of it and what one should do about it, but there is. And secondly, more recently, there's a loss of homes from the private rental market. So Rightmove reported last year there'd been a substantial drop in the number of new lettings coming onto the market over the previous year. And the anecdotal evidence, because that's all we've got at the moment, suggests that actually that sort of pulling out of the market or switching into Airbnb, which is another factor, is ongoing. And so why is there a loss of existing homes in the private rental market? I can think of three reasons. One, Airbnb is siphoning off some, and the fact that most tenants in the private rental market are on 6-month or 1-year leases means that someone who wants to switch for whatever reason from the residential market into the Airbnb market can do so relatively quickly. So the properties are quite liquid as an investment, because you can get rid of the tenant after 6 months or the year and decide to let on Airbnb if you're in a tourist area or in a city centre. So that's quite an important point. The scale of it is unclear, but it's not insignificant, and I think a previous witness gave some evidence about what the size of that flow is. And then another reason why supply has dropped is the tax increases that were introduced on private landlords in the 2010s, the explicit aim of which was to reduce investment, particularly by buy-to-let landlords in the rental market, because it was argued that buy-to-let landlords were out-competing with first-time buyers. Now, I don't want to get into the debate whether that's true or not, because there's mixed evidence on that, but those tax increases affect all landlords. But the number of people who are moving into owner occupation because they feel there's less or there is less competition from private landlords is actually much smaller than that. So there are 4 million private rental households. And yes, home ownership has increased a bit, but not by that much. And so the measures are actually having an effect in terms of reducing supply, that was explicit, but not so much in increasing owner occupation. And so as a result, it's actually more difficult for private rental housing to be more commercially viable. And before those tax increases were introduced, private rental housing, from a tax point of view, in Britain, was more disadvantaged, if that's the right term, than in any other advanced economy I'm aware of in terms of the kind of tax reliefs, etc., that you can get. So that's just made it even more less attractive compared with other countries. That's a political choice. It's not for me to comment on the morality of it or what one should do about it, but that is the case. And then secondly, the rise in interest rates seems to be pushing some landlords out of the market because they're affected by it. Many are on fixed term, of course. Mortgages are coming to an end. Many of them are on variable rate mortgages, and quite a lot, I haven't got the correct figure in front of me, are on interest-only mortgages. And so if you're on an interest-only mortgage, then a rise in the interest rate is going to hit you more, because all of your payments are interest, not the capital. So they're particularly affected, those landlords, and where they can, some landlords are increasing the rent. And in the current market, it's possible to do that because supply is going down and demand's going up. And demand, we're going too long. Demand is increasing because of the post-pandemic return to the city. People who moved out, some of them are coming back. Also, undergraduates and postgraduates are returning to Britain, so there's a big increase in overseas students. Some domestic students are going to university in a way that they held off during the pandemic because they didn't want to learn online. Can't blame them. It's terrible teaching people online. And so now they've come back, and now we have a delayed entry into owner occupation because of interest rate rises. So there's a perfect storm is a terrible phrase, hackneyed, but demand is increasing quite substantially. That's why rents are coming up, and supply is coming down to some extent.
And just pick up on the context of that. It isn't just in relation to tax, and both Proxima and the NRLA do believe now is the time for the UK government to do a review into all taxes impacting private landlords, because it's not just the changes to the mortgage interest relief. We've had removal of the 10% wear and tear allowance, a rise in corporation tax, maintaining capital gains tax, and higher rates of stamp duty. It's now 6% in Scotland on top of your land and building transaction, on top of the transaction tax if you're buying a private rented property. And then the Scottish government still argue that landlords are putting up the rent. So there needs to be a review of that. We've talked about maintenance fees and charges have all increased, but across the UK, the private rented sector is devolved. And if the Scottish government introduce a housing bill later this year, that means in 12 months we will have had the Renting Homes Act implemented in Wales, we'll have the Private Tenancies Act is coming in Northern Ireland, we've got the Renters Reform Bill in Westminster, and we'll have a housing bill in Scotland. So the private rented sector across the UK, I think that's unprecedented to have implemented primary legislation, implemented or on its way, and that is all part of the picture and the challenge as well.
I know people are itching to come in, but I think I'm going to have to hand back to the chair. because I know in the interest of time, I think.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry.
There were some interesting answers. But Nigel Mills wanted to come in at this point. I'm changing the order slightly. Nigel.
I mean, we've had quite a discourse around this. I mean, do any of you have any solutions to this then? So we've got rents going up, benefits not high enough to pay for it, risks of unaffordability to tenants, but landlords seem to be saying that there's no alternative, and interest rates are rising. I mean, what is the way out of this situation then?
Maybe I might just have a stab at that. We commissioned Capital Economics to do some research off of the back of the interest changes that were made to landlords, and I think my counterpart from Generation Rent referenced it earlier in terms of people that are switching from the private rented sector to the Airbnb sector, and they're doing that because the tax environment is more favourable for offsetting your mortgage interest. What Capital Economics have told us in their modelling is that these changes have not only contributed to a 1.5 billion loss in Treasury revenue, but they've also resulted in 1.2 million fewer properties being available by virtue of these changes. And so with some tinkering to the taxation environment for landlords and property owners, actually we want to encourage investment in the sector. So we do need to look at, if we're bringing additional homes to the sector, how that additional rate stamp duty might be foregone to encourage investment, and we need to make it more attractive for long-term sustainable tenancies to be reflected through taxation by reversing those tax changes, rather than making it more beneficial to swap to the stag do and hen do brigade at Airbnb.
By tax tinkering, you mean reinstate tax relief for mortgage interest?
Yeah, well, I mean, but if we're talking about supply, right? So we want, we absolutely accept we need to see more social homes, but actually what's happened is the PRS is very much taking on the role of the social provider with local authorities, and we see frankly perverse schemes where local authorities are almost competing with each other to get private sector landlords and having incentives. Now, incentives are great, but actually what we need is just a steady framework that landlords and renters have confidence in, and making sure that actually we have a plentiful supply of properties in both the social and private rented sector, and that the taxation is appropriate. We look at the changes and we see things have worsened significantly, and frankly the only people that are worse off are the renter.
Are you saying that people renting through Airbnb are not paying tax? I mean, presumably they owe the tax, it's just not...
No, so they're definitely paying tax, but there is a holiday lets exemption that means you can offset your full mortgage interest. That's the difference. And that has been restricted in the private rented sector for individuals. If you're an incorporated business, then you can offset your full cost. And so my point here is, as Peter said earlier, this is, you're squeezing that part of the sector because you don't want it to grow. You want to turn generation rent into generation buy. But actually, our research that we did earlier this year with Chamberlain Walker showed that the benefits that the PRS brings to the country as a whole, and if you do want to turn gen rent into gen buy, actually you need a thriving private rented sector to make sure that rents are low, standards are high, in order to gain that social mobility.
But any other solutions for how we have a problem of rent being too high and benefits being too low? Sheila?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's time for a review of LHA rates. I think they're unrealistic. In a city like Edinburgh, the levels of LHA, it makes that competition so much more. However, in Edinburgh, it's for people who are not on benefit, the story is the same. There is the obvious to increase social sector housing, and Edinburgh's heavily invested in that as well. But building properties of one bedroom isn't really lucrative for builders. So the size criteria can have an impact on that social sector as well. In Scotland, as I've said, that is fully mitigated. for the time being, but obviously that's an affordability thing as well. So for me, an increase in LHA rates is absolutely required.
Thank you, Nigel. I think, we would certainly agree with that. And as was mentioned in the first session, raising, unfreezing and raising the local housing allowance rents, and obviously increase them on an annual rate to keep up with market rate rents. So that is certainly, there's a discrepancy there.
If I remember rightly, 13 years ago, the question was, are we just allowing landlords to put up rent because they know housing benefit will follow it, and we're almost chasing rents up the tree? I mean, is there not a kind of risk of this going the wrong way?
Yeah, I don't see that. Certainly from conversations and data from our members, I think certainly where our member agents are working with claimants, they're doing a lot of work to support them. So it's certainly not a case of doing it just to get the returns through the benefit. And that was the next point I was going to make. The discretionary payments, we see some local authorities applying them, some not. I spoke to an agent in Wales, based in Cardiff, and they're working across South Wales. They're dealing with 4 local authorities, and they've all sort of got 4 different ways of doing things. So that disconnect as well is really important. But agents are doing a lot of work to engage with the team leaders in those local authorities to support claimants and tenants, certainly.
I'm guessing, Mr. Douglas, you're not fans of rent controls.
No. We're not. I mean, they are. I mean, they failed everywhere they have been, and they don't deal with the substantive issue at hand. If we're concerned about rents rising, which we all are, actually this is all within our control. It's about increasing the supply that's out there, and the Renters Reform Bill will be bringing forward measures for unfair and above market rent increases, and that's right and proper. But rent controls have failed everywhere, and we would absolutely reject that as being a palatable solution. The one thing I wanted to pick up on in terms... sorry.
I was saying that's quite a sweeping statement, failed everywhere. I just wondered if you had substantial evidence to support that view. I know there's a lot of criticism of them, but there are examples of them being used largely on a temporary basis quite successfully.
Well, I think in the Republic of Ireland they introduced rent pressure zones, and of course what did that do? Well, it actually squeezed out existing landlords, because those existing landlords were offering below market rents. The caps were rent controls were introduced on existing rents, and of course new entrants could enter the market on higher rents. So actually the good landlords who were offering below market were left. There's other examples in San Francisco. I think if you rent on a building constructed, before or after 1979, there's a date, then there's a restriction on the rent there. But what does that do? Well, it means that labour market mobility stalls, because actually people on those capped rents stay put, and they don't take advantage of the PRS doesn't offer the flexibility that it needs for people to come and go. So they're two examples where it simply...
One of which is 44 years ago. Anyway, sorry, Nigel.
Well, Rent Act tenancies as well, but what's happened to those properties? There's Rent Act tenancies in London, but the standard of those properties, they look great from the outside, but they've diminished inside because there's actually no market to update them and upgrade them, because actually the rents are capped.
So you almost want your tenant to leave, don't you? Because once your tenant leaves, you can...
Yeah, and I think there has to be an element of landlords and agents. They're housing providers. They're good people doing a good service for a lot of people, and they need to be treated as housing providers. We advocate at Property Mart for the regulation of letting agents, and there should be minimum requirements to operate outside of Scotland and Wales. That isn't the case. So there's lots that can be done, I think, outside of rent control.
I sense, Professor Kemp, you could probably do a whole seminar, maybe even a whole semester on this.
On the question of rent controls, there's an enormous literature, and the answer as to what is the impact of rent controls is it depends. It depends on how you design the rent control measure. Is it more market conforming or is it the opposite? So if you have a rent freeze, as they have in Scotland, that's not a great idea. They introduced one in Berlin, and the number of new lettings coming on the market fell by 60% in 12 months. But that's a rent freeze, it's very crude. Whereas if you had something that was a bit more, rents can only go up in line with average earnings or the retail price, consumer price index, then that would have less of an impact, but it would. It has an impact on supply, on new supply, has an impact on existing supply, and it has an impact on the condition of properties and landlords' incentives to invest. And the trouble with temporary measures is they tend to become permanent. So when we introduced rent control in 1915, sorry, a long time ago, it was meant to continue until 6 months after the war. It was only in 1988, the 1988 Housing Act, when we really got rid of that. So it is quite difficult. It'd be interesting to see what happens in Scotland, because they've already extended this rent freeze. It's on social or it wasn't initially on social and private housing. So I think one introduces some kind of rent control, soft rent control. Maybe it depends on how you decide to do it, really.
They removed it in Scotland for the social rented sector and not for the private rented sector, and didn't engage with the private rented sector in the process. So
it's a good job rents aren't linked to inflation, that's all I'll say.
Thank you. Steve McKay, back to you for your...
Thank you. You'll be delighted to know I want to leave rent controls behind. What I do want to ask about is, would you identify any particular groups of claimants in your experience that you think find it more challenging to find suitable or appropriate accommodation than others?
Sorry, Chair, I forgot to declare I rent a property out. Probably a interest that's relevant for that.
And on that basis, I better declare the same.
Right. Those should indeed be declared. Yeah, thank you for doing so.
You prospective members, that's good.
Give me the form.
I think in terms of particular groups, we heard from the last session about younger renters, but I honestly feel, and I accept that argument, by the way, that they are singled out in terms of local housing allowance and those that are effectively renting rooms at a lower rate. And I think my comments would be back to the overall supply and demand point that I made earlier, which is actually you want this safety net to be reflective of the market, whatever your need is, right? And I get that people have different needs, but the point is, at the moment, with a 3-year freeze, the amount of allowance that people are receiving, almost irrespective of their demographic or characteristic, is insufficient. And that's why, we are pushing so hard on dealing with the supply of homes and all of the things that affect that, like taxation and mortgages and standards and things like that, to make sure that we do have a plentiful supply of homes, because that gap, and we did see it during COVID, as my colleague Tim said, landlords bent over backwards during COVID, but I remember stories in London of rents going down 20-25% as people did a mass exodus for obvious reasons. And frankly, nobody was getting the violins out for the landlord, and I wasn't expecting them to. But that's the reality, right? And so, when demand changes, rents will move with it. Landlords don't set the market. And Nigel's gone, but he asked about rent increases and things like that. Well, ONS figure shows that landlords are actually, dare I say it, very bad at putting their rents up in tenancy. Over 2/3 leave rents as they are, because they would much rather work with somebody that they know and trust and have a good relationship, because we have a better standard of satisfaction, tenant satisfaction, than the social sector. The problem that we're seeing at the moment is, as people move on, rents are being reset when they come to the market. That's if they come to the market at all and not being sold, and that's putting pressure on everybody. So I wouldn't single anybody out in answer to your question. I think it comes back entirely to supply and the confidence around operating in the PRS.
I appreciate that answer, and I understand the point you're making, and obviously we heard a lot in the earlier session about younger people. As a constituency MP, I come across a lot of people with disabilities who are in very inappropriate or unsuitable accommodation, or find it really difficult to access suitable or appropriate accommodation. Is that something you would recognise yourselves?
Yes, and actually we were running a campaign on this last year to broaden members' views on some of the schemes that are actually out there to encourage accessible amendments to be made to properties, because as I'm sure you appreciate, these properties are difficult to come by. But if you get a willing landlord that knows where these grants are and things like that, and there are grants that are out there, actually you will have a tenant that stays for a long time. And that's actually what the landlord values over anything else. And I can send you details on our campaign, but we're very, very keen on this because we see the private responsible landlord as being part of the solution.
Well, I think that would be very helpful, because I think we're keen to know what else you think could be done to, by private and social landlords to help people with particular needs access appropriate accommodation. I think I'm detecting that Sheila wants to come in.
One of the groups who I feel are disadvantaged are what we call the working poor. So people who maybe receive a small amount of partial benefit or no benefit at all, and they are really struggling, and they can't access, if they don't get any housing benefit or universal credit housing costs, they can't access DHP either. So whether it's a case of looking at allowances and tapers to bring that in line with universal credit, particularly for housing benefit. Certainly that was mooted at the last session. I think a whole review of encouraging people into work needs to be done, because there's certainly a disadvantage to that at the moment.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Steve. Just picking up on that point, but of course there is a disconnect between vulnerable claimants and vulnerable tenants within the social rented sector and receipt of universal credit, and the private rented sector, in the sense of the social rented sector managers, social housing managers, can liaise directly with DWP regarding the benefit claim on the individual's behalf, which of course private landlords can't do from the outset. So there is a disconnect there when trying to support vulnerable.
Only if they have a mandate, only if they tenantalise it.
Yes, exactly. So there's still a process to go through. I think obviously the shared accommodation rate was talked about in the earlier session. I think there's no doubt about it. There's statistics that show there's more younger people renting in the private rented sector. So whether that rate should be suspended to support them, is certainly our feedback we've had from our members. But I think the final point I would make is that we've engaged with the Scottish Government and the UK Government in relation to Ukrainians settling in the UK, and obviously the Afghan resettlement scheme as well. And of course they come to our organisations to help them with property and promote that information to agents, and the NRLA the same with landlords. But of course, I think the LHA's freeze is affecting, all governments' ability to support people from Ukraine settle in the UK. I think there's a lot of work ongoing with local authorities to set up, guarantor schemes, but of course that's mixed across the country. And I think there is a willingness for the sector to engage with those communities coming to the UK, but it's very difficult in a extremely tight and competitive market.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add, Peter?
Yeah, so the people that are really struggling in terms of their rent, and let me just put that in context, 3/4 of people responding to the English Housing Survey say they don't have difficulty affording their rent, but a quarter do. And you're mainly talking there about young people, older people, because there are 7% of private tenants are older people, and you're talking about people on housing benefit and people who are on low pay but not on housing benefit. And if you look at them, and particularly if you look at the bottom 40%, the bottom two income quintiles, if you look at those people, then the proportion of people paying more than 30% of their income in rent, really, really high. So from analysis I did of the 2019-2020 English Housing Survey, 9 out of 10 people in that bottom 40% who are private tenants were paying more than 30% of their income in rent, and 30% of your income in rent is what some people use as a benchmark of affordability. It's a bit arbitrary, but that's what they do. And actually, if you look at young professionals, quite a lot of them in London and the South East are paying quite a high proportion of their income in rent, in some cases over 50%. And actually, why we're hearing about problems with affordability is precisely because it's now affecting young professionals in the market, and that reflects the imbalance of supply and demand.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Siobhan Bailey has a point, and then I'll come to Dr. Ben Spencer.
Really fascinating debate. Just to Ben, so I cannot remember a surgery appointment. I do them every week, every couple of weeks, where I haven't had a landlord from Stroud come to me incredibly worried about all this and about to give up, about all the different changes and the culmination of the different policies. And they're single property owning landlords. And equally, I have had renters come in that can't find properties, and letting agents, really brilliant people, trying to sort of work through all these issues. So it's great to hear from all you today. Of your 100,000 members, how many of those are one or two property owning landlords, or do you know what the proportion of that is? Because I think the demonisation of kind of landlords from the bad landlords and the things that hit the headlines is actually skewing the narrative, and I can see this renting reform bill that's coming through is going to be incredibly hot and very difficult to manage in this place, because there is no kind of understanding of the truth of the real market, if that makes sense. So what are the small landlords?
43% of people have one property.
Wow.
And that's a significant issue for the reasons that you highlight. We have an advice line that we support members on. For the last few weeks since renters reform, we've been receiving 3,000 calls a week from landlords because everything is really spooking them, to be honest with you, on a whole range of matters. And these aren't bad landlords, right? We know there's bad landlords in the sector, but there's good and bad of all sorts, right? We are dealing with responsible people that look after their tenants and provide good accommodation. We don't want to lose that, but I'm afraid that the forecast is not terribly sunny, should I say, because just quoting some of our research, in the first quarter of this year, 33% of private landlords in England and Wales said they plan to cut the number of properties that they rent out, in keeping with what you're hearing at your surgery. We've been tracking this sentiment for 12 years. It's the highest since for 12 years. But obviously we have demand at a record high. So 67% of landlords said demand from properties from prospective, or for properties from prospective tenants, was increasing. And so my issue here is, for all of the reasons that we articulate, local housing allowance is one part of it, right? And landlords will get beaten up for shying away from LHA. Well, there's lots of issues around not just the amount that LHA is set at, but it's how landlords in the universal credit system are engaged with. I've got tales of woe from members who have waited 16 weeks for an answer for an APA, an alternative payment arrangement. 16 weeks with no reply. I've got another one, how this lady has made 4 attempts for an online application for an APA without any response. System problems, maladministration, and we have the independent case examiner that has written back and accepted terrible delays, maladministration, rudeness, unpleasantness, the whole shebang, and all that DWP were asked to do was to say sorry, even though that landlord lost several thousands of pounds. And so I would reject any accusations of discrimination when it comes to local housing allowance or benefit claimants, and say, simply put, the system is not fit for purpose. Now, if you add that to rental reform, energy, taxation, mortgages, and bear in mind it's bad for homeowners as it is on the mortgage rates, with the tax changes, it's 20% worse for landlords. And I'm not expecting violins, but ultimately it's the tenants that suffer. And so the question will be is, where do these people go? Because there aren't any social housing. We have a crisis of confidence right the way across the sector. They go into crappy temporary accommodation, excuse my French, that costs the taxpayer a lot of money. Surely we're better than that. Surely we're better than that.
Thank you. I think Debbie Abraham's had a quick point as well.
Just very briefly, and Ben, I absolutely recognise what you're saying. They are sort of good, and I'm sure my colleagues here are good landlords, but they're also not so good. Well, I can think of a constituent in his 80s who had been in the property for about 20 years, who was served with a Section 21, and it took a lot to try and get him rehomed at that age. But I'm conscious that there have been nearly 7,000 no-fault evictions in the first quarter of this year, up from 16% from last year. Given the position that we are in regarding interest rates, mortgage rates, and yet to be determined buy-to-let agreements around how the mortgage charter will cover that, what are your estimates in terms of how that will affect Section 121 notices?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, we want to keep people in their homes, right? And what I would caution against is falling into the trap of no fault. Because what I would say is we have to look back at what the reason is that triggers that Section 21 notice. And just because we don't have to give a reason doesn't mean that there isn't one. It could well be landlords selling. And that's a perfectly legitimate reason, and landlords will be able to do that under the Renters Reform Bill. So the Renters Reform Bill is not going to help renters in that regard, right?
But on this question, so what do we anticipate, and perhaps this will help the government to focus their minds about the sort of vagueness of the mortgage charter with regard to buy-to-let?
Yeah, well, obviously the buy-to-let mortgages are not part of that charter. There's a footnote there that's not applicable to. What I would say is we know 85%, it's a figure I was going to quote earlier, of landlords have buy-to-let mortgages on an interest-only basis. Those that are highly leveraged will be up a well-known creek without a paddle, I suggest, and they're going to be looking very hard at their properties and their returns and not being able to make ends meet. And I think the forecast, I'm just trying to find the figure in my notes, but yes, so modelling by Capital Economics found that if the Bank of England's base rate was to peak at 5%, which it now has, and remain above 2.5% until the end of 2027, up to 13%, 735,000 homes in the private rented sector could be lost across the UK compared to 2021. This would lead to a loss of £1 billion in income and corporation tax per year for the Treasury. I'm normally a glass half full man, but it's difficult to see a positive outlook with regards to that. And that's why I say a lot of these things are multifaceted. It's not about, tenants and landlords. It's a homogenous group. And, tax, mortgages, supply, local housing allowance, the administration therein of, all needs to be working to give those participants confidence.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thanks, Chairman. I'm going to follow on the theme about what the sector can do, both linking with DWP and around trust in people who are benefits claimants. And I just declare an interest. I've received support from those of interest in this area, and obviously draw attention to my register of interests. Timothy, you mentioned, I think, about the fact that you can't, well, in fact, and you as well, Ben, that the difficulties and challenges about having that interaction or no interaction with the DWP, particularly around APAs, which I know we as a committee have commented on before about the importance of an effective APA system. What's your take then in terms of what would you like to see change going forwards? And as a corollary of that, is there a tension or a danger for particularly private sector landlords getting more involved in direct engagement with the DWP on behalf of renters? Ben?
Yes, I mean, we would like that because at the end of the day, we want to sustain tenancies, and I've got tales of woe where Universal Credit will not speak to my landlord, and they're being overpaid thousands. They're saying we've got money we're not entitled to. How do we give it back? Well, we can't talk to you. We need to talk to the tenant. Well, good luck with that. And this big bureaucracy is not helpful. Not everybody is a criminal. Not everybody is out to rip people off, right? And so we want to encourage those responsible landlords to have a positive working relationship with the universal credit system. But what do we want to see change with regards to universal credit? An end to the 5-week wait, for renters would be a good start. Why do we make the most vulnerable in society wait 5 weeks? I've heard Ian Duncan-Smith, the architect of UC, say it can be done within a matter of days. Well, why don't we do it? Why do we set people up to fail? Why do we start people off in arrears? Why do we have that loan at the outset? Why don't we convert that into a grant? And why don't we, if we trust people to want to receive the money themselves, renters to receive the money themselves, why don't we trust people if they say we want to direct pay the landlord at the outset? And it comes back to your point, which is the vilification. Actually, it doesn't help the rhetoric around this stuff. We need practical solutions, and we've got plenty.
I'd certainly agree with that. I think the 5-week wait is an issue and has changed, agents and landlords' perception of universal credit and the whole renting with benefits. I think we would advocate turning the advance, the loan, into a grant to help those most in need, and they can have that money straight away. But I also think greater flexibility in terms of, yes, we've got the choices in Scotland, the split payments, but whether that's monthly, fortnightly or weekly, we need that flexibility in terms of the rent to continue to be paid. I think in terms of as a sector organisation engaging with the Department for Work and Pensions, up until 2019 we had a PRS engagement group that stalled due to the pandemic and stopped, but that was a useful forum which met with landlord groups, NRLA, Property ourselves, to engage with officials quarterly. We met. We've actually written in January this year to the Secretary of State, Mel Stride, in relation to that, and we had a response back in February to say yes, they are conscious that engagement has dropped. We have had a meeting with officials, and we've had a follow-up even to say it is still in the pipeline. So we're hoping that forum will reopen and allow us as sector organisations to feed these issues in, because we did do a lot of work around digitalising the UC 47 form. We had the tech people from within the department would come and give presentations, and landlords and agents would say, no, that will work with an application, that won't. Issues with work coaches in localities across the country, we were able to work with the DWP on that and engage and solve those issues. So we're hoping that engagement with the department will start up again, and we've pushed for that.
I have reservations about unfettered access to information. I think it would have to be very regulated and very controlled. I have been on the end of that type of conversation before, and this is about dignity and respect for tenants. Just because they're on benefit doesn't, dictate that they won't pay their rent. And I think any conversation around that, extending that information to someone, has to be at the absolute consent of the tenant and following a huge discussion of what they're doing there. But I think the engagement with tenants needs to be, if it's to work for universal credit, the job coaches conversations need to be extended. And have those, because it's 17 minutes I think they get for a session when they're working with someone. If you're working with someone and you need to help them sort the rent out, I think you need more than 17 minutes. So maybe it's a resourcing issues at job centres as well that means that we could actually fix the problem rather than offering the solution of free access to information.
But in Scotland, of course, letting agents are qualified. We've got landlord registers across Wales, Scotland, and there's a training requirement in Wales as well and Northern Ireland. Through the renters reform, there's potentially avenues to register and regulate agents and landlords, and in order to ensure that they can step in and work, get the housing element directly paid on a almost trusted partnership basis that we see in the social rented sector. I think we need that option.
And just to come back, I don't think we need unfettered access to the universal credit system. We just need better access, right? So I've got one story from a member who was in contact with UC to get an APA, and universal credit required the tenant's date of birth. So the other way, we weren't asking for it, it needed to be required. The landlord, for whatever reason, wasn't able to provide that. And even though it's not information that's regularly kept by the DWP, as I understand it, it meant a significant delay to resolving that particular issue. And the tenant was 4 months in arrears. And that we know that hurts individual landlords. So I don't think we want unfettered access, but I think we want reasonable dialogue to resolve some of these issues, because we might have been able to resolve that problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Sir Desmond Swain.
I should declare my interest in the register as a private landlord. How can we improve the performance of the valuation office agency in calculating the local housing allowance, and also the data that it gets from letting agencies and private landlords? Should we impose another requirement on them too?
Well, I think, I mean, certainly, I suppose with the VOA, we the negative or the challenge is that obviously the collection is voluntary, therefore they can only use essentially what they have. We as an organisation have engaged with the VOA in order to ensure that there's a flexibility in the ways that agents provide that information, and to be fair, they've done a lot of work in ensuring that the information can be provided through CRM systems, contacting them directly for a regional officer or a simple form, or they can visit in branch. So I think the VOA have done a lot of work there, and they've now got 10 hub managers across England. They attend all of our events and conferences, and we've actually put together an asset pack to try and encourage agents to provide that information, because it's ultimately vitally important and feeds into that process. There is, I think, a potential option in terms of using the landlord registers across the UK, there's Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and potentially the Renters Reform Bill in terms of collecting more information, but it would be an issue for government whether they actually mandate it via registered and regulated agents.
I think the answer to that question, Sir Desmond, is the property portal that's muted in the Renters Reform Bill. I don't think we're talking about the Colonel's secret recipe in eliciting rent data from landlords. I wouldn't be worried about providing it. I'd be worried about providing other types of data potentially, but I'm not worried about providing rent data. But the slightly irritating thing is that we've had tenancy deposit protection in place since 2007, and when you register a deposit, you're always asked how much your rent is and how much your deposit is. And so we're creating a new scheme to collect data. The data is already out there. Data's been out there since 2007. I used to work for one of the deposit schemes, so I know that it's there. I suspect we probably just need to make better use of the data that we have, rather than creating new bureaucracies that alienate landlords and letting agents.
And the broad rental market areas that designate the different local housing allowances within them, are they properly drawn up? Are they effective, or are they all over the shop?
I think it has been raised to us that certainly the size of the areas can be a challenge, but from conversations with the VOA, changing all 150 odd areas would take a huge amount of resource and consultation. I think if you look at the current requirements, where a regular programme of rolling programme of regular monitoring can be done by the government in terms of significant changes to the proportion of facilities, change to transport, housing times, you would probably be better off perhaps linking those reviews to local plans, when local plans are developed by local authorities, because ultimately they are changing facilities and infrastructure in areas, rather than tinkering with the existing system, which we understand would take huge resource and consultation.
Professor Kemp, do you have any comments on the way the VOA does its job of working out the local housing?
One on that, and one on the broad rental market area. So what they're looking at rent officers is the stock of lettings, returns rents on the stock of lettings, and that's fine. But if you're looking for a new property, what you have to pay is the rent on new lettings. And the thing is that if you use the rent officer data, which the ONS uses, rents over the previous year have gone up by 4%. But if you look at Zoopla's data, which is about new lettings, new properties coming on the market, what the landlord is asking for, which is not necessarily what the landlord gets, because these days, because of high rising demand, it's often higher, it's actually gone up by 10%. So the rent officer service says it's 4%. Zoopla, who are in the market and have got a massive database, say it's 10%. And so in a sense, the data that have been used to set the broad rental the 30% is actually not really the right data. And it may be that Zoopla and Rightmove could be persuaded because to provide data that's more up.
But that's only advertised rents. I think agreed rents.
It's not agreed rents, it's advertised rents.
But agreed rents is what we want.
Okay, yes, but, well, where do you get it from? Would you rather say...
Would you get it from the landlords, the agents, deposit schemes, existing data that's out there?
Well, there seems to be a problem at the moment, but even leaving aside who you get it from, the rent officer's data is about the stock, whereas the people going to look for rental housing now, they have to pay what the rental market suggests. And so rents have gone up by 10% if you look at Zoopla data, but only 4% if you look at valuation of this data. And so it's not going to help you that, people who've already got a property, are paying much less because you have to pay the asking rent, well, not the asking rent, the rent that's achieved. And because now there are far more tenants chasing every vacant property, the pressure is upward and people are having to bid against each other in order to secure a property.
I think just on that point, there's probably a conversation to be had with the VOA in terms of how they do that. I mean, as I understand it, the data they collect is new rents, existing rents, and renewals, and they put that together. So it may be that there's a consideration to the VOA that they separate out that information in order to provide a more accurate picture. And I understand they could do that, but it would obviously change. Wouldn't be able to do it instantly, but they could do that through their processes.
And Mr. Beadle, you suggested that the property portal in the new legislation might provide another source of data. I mean, would that overcome these difficulties?
It might do, but I would also put it to you that data will also be provided to the deposit scheme as the deposit is registered in any event. I just think there is an opportunity through the property portal, because I see the property portal as a way for good landlords to prove they're compliant and tenants to have access to the information that they need. So I'd have no issue of providing that rent data. The question would be, how is it maintained and kept up to date going forwards? But that's a whole different conundrum.
Can we just go back to Professor Kemp's point about the areas you were...
Yeah, so they're really rather broad. They used to be about 300, I think. They're now 150, and they're supposed to be areas within which it's reasonable for a housing benefit claimant to search for accommodation and work and shop and all the rest of it. And maybe it works in some areas, but in certain areas it doesn't. So if you look at York and if you look at Oxford, probably the same as Cambridge. That rents in the villages around Oxford, the rents are much lower than they are in the centre. The centre are very high indeed. And so is that really appropriate when the average that's used across that area will be lower because you've got all these properties, the villages and small towns surrounding it? And rents are much lower there because you've got to commute. But who can do that commuting? Is it if someone is on housing benefit? They haven't got cars. If they haven't got cars, they're less likely to have cars. Then commuting into Oxford is quite difficult. I'm sure the same is true of Cambridge, same at York. So it's really quite broad. And then if you look at Blackpool, actually some of the surrounding areas are rather wealthy, much more wealthy than the centre. And you have the opposite effect. It sort of inflates the broad rental market area allowed. So I think actually it would be better to revert to the original, which was based on actually rent levels, so sort of sub-market levels, and rent officers were supposed to work out what the rents were in particular areas. It'd be more finely tuned, and you'd get away from this inflated or underinflated rent situation.
Can I just put some final points to you in closing? The discussion. First of all, Mr. Beadle, you've and Mr. Douglas as well, you've referred to tax changes that are making things harder for private landlords. Can you just talk us through, I mean, are these changes, just talk us through what these changes are and when they took effect? Are these very new things, or?
Specifically, the principal concern is around mortgage interest relief for individuals. That was brought in 2015, but on a phased basis over 4 years. And so 2021, I think, was the when it fully came into impact. And essentially what it means is that you cannot offset your full mortgage interest against your tax return. And so when we see mortgage rate increases, yes, they apply to everybody, but given depending on your tax status, it will cost you 20% more if you're an unincorporated buy-to-let landlord. And that's really problematic because effectively you could be paying tax on your turnover rather than your profit. And that's what's causing us, one of the reasons. I fully accept not every landlord has a mortgage, about 60% has a mortgage, but so these are all multifaceted things. Tim referred to wear and tear allowance. You used to get a 10% kind of credit on wear and tear.
When did that go?
I think it was, I'd have to double check, I think it was 2020.
It was all part of those changes that what George Osborne introduced, but you now actually just have to submit your evidence on what you do. So it's messier, but it's perhaps relief, but it's perhaps more accurate. So there's the change in tax relief, which has been converted actually to a tax credit, actually, and so it increases your income, and therefore it can push you, if you're at the margin between one tax band and another, push you up, and you can also pay tax even if you're not earning any money, because you're being taxed on turnover. I don't know another investment where you can be taxed on turnover. It seems strange. And then secondly, there's the stamp duty thing, which has been, you pay an extra 3% surcharge if you buy a property, and the idea is to make it less competitive to buy properties for rent, and then you pay an 8% surcharge. This is England, by the way. Not
England and Northern Ireland, 3%.
You pay an 8% surcharge on capital gains tax. So really, when you buy, you pay more, when you sell, you pay more, and when you operate, you pay more. And really, taken together, they're really quite considerable. I'm not a politician, I'm not into politics, but it sounded to me like it's very unconservative policy, to be honest, but, you know, don't quote me. But it is serious in terms of, you know, we need a private rental sector, and so we need to have a commercially viable private rental market that can provide secure, affordable and decent accommodation, and we're some way from that, actually, in the bottom end of the market we're talking about.
But I think the key to policy making in the private rental sector is that, you know, there's 7 government departments in Westminster that all interact with the private rental sector, and we need them to continually be coming together to review these issues. And I think you know, and then the property tax element is devolved. So we're saying it's 3% to buy to let in England and Northern Ireland. I think they've added a 1% in Wales, so it's 4%. And then you've got a 6% in Scotland. But of course the tax system and all those changes will affect all landlords UK-wide. So we've got to be interacting with that devolved nature of policy making, but across the departments in Westminster as well.
And that does explain the Airbnb side, the holiday let side, where you don't have those exemptions. And rather than repeat these draconian measures on Airbnb, actually I think we should encourage investment in the sector, because some of the things that we're talking about today on local housing allowance, you know, it's the people at the very bottom of the market that are really struggling, and the gap is widening.
Presumably, I mean, the Treasury never intended to kind of particularly support Airbnb, did it?
No, but it set out deliberately to cool the market. And, you know, it's been a massive success in terms of cooling the market, and look where we are. And I would just respectfully make the point that we need more homes, and actually having a punishing tax regime helps nobody.
Okay, thank you. You gave us some awful examples a few minutes ago of landlords asking the DWP question and just not getting a reply. I mean, how common is that experience? Hopefully in some places the DWP does better than that, but what's the sort of general experience?
This is one of the things that puts people off, frankly. You know, I would liken it to staying at a dodgy hotel or going to a dodgy restaurant. You know, you probably wouldn't go back. And I think, you know, whilst I'm sure there are good examples out there, there are too many bad examples, and I will write to the committee with some of those examples if that's okay.
That would be of interest, and also some sense of how widespread this is. And I just wonder finally whether there are things that occur to you that the DWP could do in order to allow landlords to be more supportive to tenants than they can be at the moment. Are there, beyond things that we've already mentioned, is there anything that occurs to you?
It's about increasing engagement, Chair, to be honest with you. You know, we shouldn't look at landlords as being a problematic customer, which is how a lot of landlords feel at the moment. Actually, we want to help our tenants. We want to help our tenants set up alternative payment arrangements and all of those types of things. But we do need them to engage with us, and I think it would be really helpful, if the committee could encourage DWP to be more collaborative in terms of their working with the very users of the scheme.
Yeah, and I'd echo that. I think that's building on the stakeholder work that we've pushed for the department to re-engage with the representative bodies, but certainly from agents on the ground, it's communication and relationship building is key.
Mr. Kent?
What can do? Well, it costs money, doesn't it? But we have a 5-week wait. The idea was that it was supposed to mimic work, but you don't have to wait 5 weeks to get your first paycheck. And the fact is that most claimants have little or no savings. So, going 5 weeks means you're in danger of getting into rent arrears. So that's a problem. That's one reason why landlords won't let you. And then on top of that, in some areas, there are delays in processing claims, quite considerable delays. So it's often more than 5 weeks. So you're talking about people who've got no savings, or very little, £50 or something, having to struggle, having to wait. And then, of course, landlords, this is like a big investment risk for their business risk, rather. That will this person actually, when will they get the money? And how much will the rent arrears be? So I think ending this 5-week wait would be helpful, actually. I'm afraid uprating automatically the local housing allowance with the 30th percentile. 30% of private tenants are on housing benefits, so it's not unreasonable to have that. Just automatically uprating it, as it used to be, will help the relationship between landlords and tenants. And then the final point is, it's important to remember, actually, it's the claimants. The tenant who is the claimant, not the landlord. So the confidentiality issue is quite important. And a reason why we pay as a default the tenant, not the landlord, is about encouraging responsibility, knowing what your rent is and looking for accommodation. And you are the person who should be getting it unless there are payment problems, addiction problems, or people can't manage their money. So in that debate, I understand where they're coming from, but you're talking about alternative payment arrangements. Yep. That's different from the generality, and you need to make, I think, that distinction.
Sheila?
Yeah, I think the DWP probably need to work more closely, as I've said earlier, with tenants, but it's about not just about universal credit housing costs or housing benefit. It's really about all benefits and maximising their income so that they're in a position to meet their liabilities. One of the most underclaimed benefits is council tax reduction. Now, I know in England there are various schemes and it's a more complex landscape, but certainly in Scotland, even with the simplest joined up scheme, we see this, and universal credit is probably partly to blame for that as well, that people aren't being encouraged to, as a tick box, and that's your application made. And I don't think people are being encouraged to do that because we're not seeing CTRS going in the right direction. So I think the DWP need to broaden their horizons in supporting people access total income rather than just that one specific benefit that they're dealing with.
Well, thank you all very much indeed for a very interesting and helpful session. That concludes our questions to you. And it concludes our meeting. Order, order.